Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are doing something a little different with the source material. We are performing an autopsy on a single word.
And not just any word. Probably the most loaded, weaponized, and frankly misunderstood word in modern political dictionary.
Yeah, we're talking about the F word,
Yeah.
fascism. And I have to be honest, when I saw this topic in our stack of sources for the week, my first reaction was just exhaustion.
I completely get that.
I mean, I feel like I see this word 50 times a day. You check your social media, and the politician who wants lower taxes is a fascist. The politician who wants higher taxes is a fascist.
Right.
The HOA president who, measures your grass with a ruler, definitely a fascist.
Exactly. It's the grammar police phenomenon writ large. We've essentially taken a very specific, terrifying political ideology from the 20th century and turned it into a generic synonym for a bully. Or just someone who is telling you to do something you don't want to do.
It's semantic saturation.
Yes,
Yeah.
Perfectly said. When a word is stretched to mean everything, it essentially means nothing at all.
Which is incredibly dangerous, right? Because if we cry wolf, or I guess in this case cry wolf in a black shirt, every time someone mildly annoys us, we lose the vocabulary to identify the actual threat when it shows up.
Huh.
It's like we've dulled the blade by using it to cut cardboard.
That is precisely the issue.
Mm.
And that is our mission for you today. We are going to strip away the internet slang, the partisan insults, the noise. We are going back to the source code.
The actual machinery of it.
Right. We have a really fascinating stack of research to go through today. We've got historical diaries from 1919, psychological profiles of Mussolini and Hitler, and some very sharp modern political theory. We're going to ask what the mechanics of fascism actually are, not the vibe, but the gears and levers.
The source code of tyranny. I really like that framing.
Right.
We're going to act as engineers here. We'll deconstruct how this machine was built in the past so you can see if anyone is trying to run that same software today.
And just a quick heads up for you, the listener. We aren't here to tell you who to vote for. We aren't here to slap a label on your least favorite political figure. We are strictly looking at the sources to hand you a diagnostic toolkit.
An objective checklist.
Exactly. We want you to understand the patterns based on historical precedent so you can look at the world with clear eyes and make your own determinations.
So, to understand the disease, we really have to go back to the site of the original infection. We need to set the timeline to 1919. And I think for most of us, when we picture 1919, it's just sepia-tone footage of guys in trenches walking in that weird, fast, jerky way because of the old camera frame
This
rates.
feels ancient.
Right? It feels completely disconnected from us. But the sources we have paint a much more chaotic, visceral picture of that era.
You really have to understand the psychological whiplash Europe was going through. This is the crucial context that usually gets skipped in high school history classes. Think about the world in 1913, just a few years prior to the total breakdown. It was the age of technological utopia.
This was the era of the massive World's Fairs.
Yes. You had the telegraph connecting the globe instantly. You had the steamship and the railroad completely conquering distance. You had early airplanes conquering the sky.
It was an era of supreme optimism.
It was. There was this genuine, deeply held belief among Europeans that technology was going to liberate humanity, that society was simply too interconnected, too civilized, and too modern for barbarism. They literally thought they had solved the problem of war.
Because they were rewriting the laws of physics and the laws of society, it felt like an unstoppable upward trajectory.
And then August 1914 hits. And suddenly, all that genius, all that massive industrial capacity is repurposed for one single thing, the meat grinder.
The scale of the destruction is still hard to fathom.
The airplane becomes a terror bomber. Chemistry becomes mustard gas. Engineering becomes the mechanized machine gun. The very things that were supposed to save humanity were instead used to liquefy an entire generation of young men in the mud of the Somme.
The psychological profiles in our sources describe this as a cognitive dissonance on a continental scale.
That's a great way to put it.
You have a generation of young men who were told they were the masters of the universe, the pinnacle of civilization, and then they were thrown into a muddy trench to be dissolved by artillery fire.
Yeah.
That completely breaks a society's brain.
It shatters it. And
Yeah.
when the war finally ends in 1918, that trauma doesn't just neatly evaporate. You have millions of men returning home, and they are completely broken. But they are also dangerous.
Because they've been fundamentally rewired.
Right. They are completely desensitized to extreme violence. They've spent 4 years learning that the absolute only way to solve a problem is to physically destroy the obstacle. And they return to countries that are economically and spiritually ruined.
Which brings us to our two main historical case studies, or rather, our two patients. Italy and Germany.
Let's start with Italy.
Yeah, because I think people often forget that fascism was an Italian invention long before it was German. Mussolini was the architect. Hitler was just the fanboy.
By a full decade, yes. And Italy is a really strange case because, technically speaking, they won. They were on the winning team of World War I. They sat at the victor's table at Versailles.
So why were they so furious? Usually, the winners are throwing parades and building massive victory arches.
They called it the mutilated victory. That was the specific phrase that appeared on walls and in newspapers everywhere. See, Italy originally joined the war because the Allies, Britain and France, promised them huge chunks of territory, parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Dalmatian coast.
It was a purely transactional deal, blood for land.
Exactly. But when they actually got to the peace conference, the Allies basically ghosted them. Woodrow Wilson and the other leaders said, well, we're doing this new global concept called self-determination now, so you don't actually get that land. Thanks for the help, though.
Wow. And Italy lost, what, over 500,000 men?
About 600,000 dead.
Yeah.
And they had absolutely nothing to show for it but crippling debt, massive inflation, and profound national shame.
They felt completely played by the international community.
They felt deeply humiliated. And if there is one core emotion that drives the fascist machine, it is humiliation. But, if Italy felt cheated, Germany was living through an absolute apocalypse.
We've all seen the black and white photos of the wheelbarrows of cash,
Yep.
right? But the economic data in the sources give some wild statistics that really drive home how insane it was.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around the numbers. In 1918, you could buy a loaf of bread in Germany for half a mark. By 1923, that exact same loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks.
Billion, with a B.
Money entirely ceased to function as a concept. You have historical accounts of people sitting in a cafe ordering a cup of coffee, and by the time they finished drinking it, the price of the coffee had literally doubled.
There's that famous anecdote, I think it's in one of the primary source diaries in our stack, about a guy who brings a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy some groceries. He leaves it outside the store for just a second, and someone dumps all the money out onto the street and steals the wheelbarrow.
Because the wood of the wheelbarrow had more intrinsic value than the mountain of paper money inside it. It's funny in a really dark way, but think about the psychological toll that takes on a person. If you followed all the rules, if you saved your money in the bank, and you were a good, law-abiding citizen, you were completely ruined. The entire system had failed you. So you have a massive population that is starving, their life savings are wiped out, and they've just lost a brutal war, along with 13% of their national territory. They are looking at their brand new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, and thinking, this system is a suicide pact.
That is the fork-in-the-road moment. Democracy looked weak, it looked agonizingly slow, it looked like a polite debating society while the house was actively burning down. People were incredibly desperate for a radical alternative.
Right.
But here's the thing. In 1919, the biggest, flashiest alternative on the table wasn't fascism. It was what was happening right next door in Russia.
The Bolsheviks. The Russian Revolution. Yes. The communists were saying, look, the system is broken because the wealthy elite stole everything from you. Let's physically seize the factories. Let's eliminate the ruling class. Let's redistribute all the land to the peasants. And if you are a starving, desperate factory worker in Milan or Munich, that sounds like a pretty solid, immediate plan.
So this massive fear of a violent communist takeover is the background radiation for everything we're about to discuss. Fascism doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It happens as a direct, visceral reaction.
It positions itself as the third way. It tells the population we entirely reject the weak, corrupt democracy that is letting you starve. But we also fiercely reject the godless communism that wants to take your private property and destroy your national identity. It frames itself as the ultimate savior.
Okay, so enter the protagonist of our first act, the man who actually wrote the source code, Benito Mussolini. And this is where the historical record gets genuinely weird, because Mussolini did not start out on the far right.
No, quite the opposite, actually. He was a rising rock star of the Italian radical left. He was a top socialist journalist and editor. He had police mugshots on file for organizing violent worker protests. He was the guy loudly shouting about global class struggle.
So how does a die-hard socialist agitator become the founding father of extreme right-wing fascism? That seems like a massive, inexplicable U-turn. Was it just pure political opportunism?
It was partly opportunism, sure, but it was primarily the war that shifted him. The mainstream socialists were internationalists. They firmly believed that a poor German worker and a poor Italian worker had much more in common with each other than they did with their own wealthy generals. Their whole slogan was, "Workers of the world, unite." So naturally, they vehemently opposed entering World War I.
But Mussolini saw the conflict differently.
Mussolini was deeply intoxicated by the violence of it. He started to see war not as a capitalist meat grinder, but as a cleansing fire. He came to believe that class identity didn't matter nearly as much as national identity.
He thought the blood bound them together.
Yes. He believed that the shared horrific experience of the military trench was far more unifying and powerful than the shared experience of the factory floor. So he broke completely with the socialists, enlisted in the military, and came back from the front lines with a brand new, very dangerous idea.
This is the concept of the trenchocracy. I highlighted this specific term in the notes because it's such a dark, compelling idea. It sounds like something a sci-fi villain would invent for a dystopian government.
It's brilliant political branding, in a terrifying way. He looked at these millions of angry, discarded, traumatized veterans, and he told them, "You aren't victims. You are the new aristocracy."
Wow.
He argued that the old traditional elites, the politicians, the wealthy lawyers, the factory owners, were soft and decadent. They hadn't faced death. They hadn't bled for Italy. But the men of the trenches, they had been forged in absolute fire.
So they earned the right to lead.
Exactly. He told them they had the moral right to rule society because they had proven they were willing to kill and die for the state.
It essentially takes their deepest trauma and reframes it as a superpower. I'm not broken. I'm superior to everyone else.
And he gave that superiority a uniform, the infamous black shirts. And he gave them a powerful ancient symbol. He dug deep into the history books, looking all the way back to the Roman Empire, and pulled out the fasces.
Which is where the actual word fascism comes from.
Yeah.
Walk us through this symbol, because I've definitely seen this carved onto American government buildings, haven't I?
You absolutely have. It's on the wall of the U.S. House of Representatives right now, behind the podium. It's carved into the arms of the chair at the Lincoln Memorial. It is simply a tight bundle of wooden rods tied firmly around an axe.
And historically, it's just a metaphor for unity.
Right. A single wooden stick snaps very easily over your knee. But a tight bundle of sticks is completely unbreakable. It represents strength through unity and collective power.
But Mussolini takes that ancient symbol and gives it a very specific authoritarian spin.
For him, the bundle didn't just mean unity, it meant total conformity. We are one single massive unit. There is absolutely no individual stick anymore. You do not matter as an individual. You are just part of the bundle.
The axe sticking out of the top.
The axe is the violent authority of the state to punish anyone who tries to stick out from the bundle.
Speaking of punishment, we have to talk about the squadristi, the black shirts. Because they weren't just a political party campaigning for votes. They were an active street gang.
They were a full-blown paramilitary wing. Mussolini sent them out into the streets to directly terrorize his former friends, the socialists. They would burn down opposition newspaper offices, completely smash up union headquarters, physically beat up striking workers. But the historical sources detail a very specific tactic they use that I think truly reveals the underlying psychology of the fascist source code: the castor oil treatment.
Yeah, please walk us through this, because when you hear castor oil, it just sounds like some harmless, old-timey home remedy, but they literally used it as an instrument of torture.
It was pure psychological warfare. The black shirts would kidnap a prominent socialist mayor or a respected labor union leader, violently drag them into the center of the public square and physically hold them down. Then they would pry their mouth open and force-feed them massive quantities of liters at a time of this incredibly potent laxative.
And the physical result is exactly what you think it is.
Uncontrollable diarrhea. Right there in public, in front of the people they led. And while it might sound almost juvenile or crude at first, think deeply about the political intent behind it. They didn't just want to assassinate you, they wanted to unmake you as a human being.
To destroy the aura of leadership.
Yes, they wanted to graphically show your loyal followers that you were physically weak, disgusting, and literally soiling yourself. It completely stripped away all human dignity. It proved that the fascist gang had total, undeniable control over your physical body.
That is horrifyingly effective. It instantly kills the mystique of the opposition leader. I mean, it's incredibly hard to respect or follow a guy you just watched be degraded in that specific state.
Exactly. It turns a serious political enemy into a pathetic public joke.
But here is the massive million-dollar question, and I think this is arguably the most important part of the entire Mussolini origin story. You have literal gangs of armed men roaming the Italian streets, brutally beating people up, setting buildings on fire, torturing mayors. Where are the local police? Where's the national government? Why on earth weren't these guys just locked up?
That brings us to the most critical lesson of the entire source code: elite legitimization.
This is the part of the research that honestly scares me the most.
It really should, because Mussolini did not seize power against the will of the establishment. He was actively invited in through the front door. The wealthy business owners, the conservative politicians, the Catholic Church, they all looked at the violent blast shirts in the streets and they thought, well, yes, they are incredibly vulgar and they are terribly violent, but they are violently beating up the communists.
The classic enemy of my enemy is my my useful idiot?
That's exactly what they thought. The elites genuinely believed they could ride the tiger. They aggressively funded Mussolini. They provided cover for his gangs. They pressured the King of Italy to accommodate him. And finally, in 1922, when Mussolini threatened to unleash a massive march on Rome with 30,000 black shirts, the king didn't call out the National Army to crush the rebellion.
He literally opened the palace gates and offered Mussolini the job of prime minister.
He handed him the keys to the state. Fascism almost always arrives legally. That's the great hack of the system. You use the existing democratic process to gain executive power, and then once you have the levers, you systematically dismantle the machine from the inside so no one can ever vote you out.
And once he's inside the house, the trenchocracy becomes the absolute law of the land. Believe, obey, fight.
Total unthinking submission. You do not think for yourself. The leader thinks for you.
Okay, so that's the prototype, the version 1.0 of the software. Now we have to move to the student. Because intensely watching all of this unfold from across the Alps is a young, failed art student and incredibly angry German veteran named Adolf Hitler.
He is the ultimate student of this movement. He actually kept a bust of Mussolini on his desk at the early Nazi headquarters. He utterly worshipped the guy. He watched the march on Rome succeed and he thought, that is exactly how I'm going to save Germany.
But 1920s Germany is a very different landscape than Italy. Hitler takes the Mussolini source code, but he installs a massive new plugin, a very dark, very specific ideological plugin: race.
Right. Mussolini was fundamentally a nationalist. For him, everything was about the glory of the state. Hitler was a racialist. For him, everything was about the purity of the blood. And to truly understand how he weaponized this, we have to look closely at the stab in the back myth, what the Germans called the Dolchstoß legend.
This is essentially the original big lie of the 20th century.
It absolutely is. The factual reality was that the German army definitively lost World War I. They were starved out, outproduced, and utterly defeated on the battlefield. But the powerful narrative that Hitler pushed and that millions of desperate Germans eagerly believed was that the incredible German army was never actually defeated in the field. They were standing tall in enemy territory when the armistice was signed.
So how did they lose, according to the myth?
The lie was that they only lost because they were viciously betrayed at home by internal traitors, by the November criminals, by the weak democratic politicians, by the communists, and specifically and most lethally by the Jews.
He hands the devastated population a convenient scapegoat for all of their national shame. It's a very seductive lie. He's telling them, it's not your fault you're poor and humiliated, it's their fault.
Yeah. And to permanently bolster this idea of innate superiority, he constructs a totally mythic past. This is where the whole concept of the Aryan master race enters the picture. And honestly, I think we need to spend a minute on this, because the actual origin of this specific concept is so academically stupid, it would almost be funny if it hadn't led directly to the Holocaust.
It's based on a massive linguistic error, isn't it?
Totally. Back in the 19th century, early scholars studying languages realized that Sanskrit, ancient Greek, Latin, and early German all shared a deep, common root language. They decided to label this root language group Indo-European or Aryan, which simply meant noble in ancient Sanskrit. It was purely a category of grammar.
Right. It's exactly like saying Romance languages.
Yeah.
It obviously doesn't mean that French people are a specific biological race that is entirely different from Spanish people. It just means their verbs conjugate the same way.
Exactly. It's a taxonomy of words.
Hmm.
But various German pseudoscientists took this dry linguistic term and violently twisted it into a sweeping biological fantasy. They literally invented a fictitious master race called the Aryans. They confidently claimed that ethnic Germans were the purest living descendants of this ancient blonde super race that had supposedly built the Egyptian pyramids, the Greek Parthenon, and the Roman Empire.
It's the ultimate historical retcon. They just looked at history and said, everything cool that ever happened in human civilization. Yeah, that was actually us.
And the swastika. That was simply an ancient geometric symbol found all over the world. You see it in early India, Japan, Native American cultures. It was generally a harmless good luck charm. Hitler culturally appropriated it and totally rebranded it as an ancient, exclusive Aryan rune. He was deliberately building an elaborate fantasy world to morally justify real-world violence.
So he has the powerful myth. He builds the militia, the brown shirts, who are directly modeled on Mussolini's black shirts. And in 1923, he decides to copy Mussolini's homework exactly. He launches the beer hall putsch.
And it is an absolute, unmitigated disaster. He tries to violently seize control of the city of Munich by force. He bursts into a crowded political meeting at a beer hall, fires his pistol into the ceiling, and dramatically declares a national revolution. But the local police don't back down. They shoot back. 16 Nazis are killed in the street. Hitler wildly dislocates his shoulder trying to run away, flees the scene, and is promptly arrested.
And in a normal, healthy timeline, this is exactly where the historical footnote ends. Local crazy guy yells in a bar, gets into a shootout, goes to prison for treason.
But this humiliating failure is actually the precise moment the ideological virus mutates into something much deadlier. While he is sitting in a comfortable jail cell dictating Mein Kampf to his deputy, Hitler realizes something strategically crucial. He realizes that the German state is simply too strong to overthrow with a disorganized street mob. You can't just forcefully march on Berlin like Mussolini marched on Rome.
He realizes he can't just shoot his way into the chancellor's office.
No, he explicitly writes that the movement now needs to use determined cooperation between brute force and political aims. He needs to actually get elected. He makes the calculated decision to use the legal tools of democracy to permanently destroy democracy.
That is such a chilling strategic pivot. It's the villain saying, I will play entirely by your polite rules until I win the game, and the second I do, I will burn the rule book to ashes.
And for a good long while, it really doesn't work. Throughout the mid-1920s, the Nazis are viewed as a fringe extremist joke. They barely get any votes. But then 1929 happens, the global Great Depression hits, the massive economic despair returns to Germany. And suddenly, the angry guy screaming at rallies about the stab in the back starts making a whole lot of sense to terrified people again.
And, just like we saw in Italy, he desperately needed the established elites to unlock the final door for him. Fast forward to 1933. The Nazis have become the largest single party in the parliament, but they still don't have an absolute majority. The mainstream conservative politicians, wealthy, aristocratic men like Franz von Papen, think they're much smarter than Hitler. Von Papen actually famously said to a colleague, in 2 months, we'll have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll squeak.
He'll squeak, meaning we will completely control him. The traditional elites looked down on Hitler. They thought he was an uneducated, vulgar clown who just happened to be good at giving speeches. They thought they could use his massive populist appeal to permanently crush the communists, and then the real adults in the room would quietly run the country from behind the scenes. So they convinced the aging president to legally make him chancellor.
And what happens within a month of him taking that legal office?
The Reichstag fire. The National Parliament building mysteriously burns down. It is immediately blamed on a communist arsonist. Hitler uses the panic to declare a sweeping national state of emergency. He legally suspends all constitutional civil liberties, and as we know, he never ever gives them back.
It's totalitarian velocity. He goes from being a constrained chancellor in a coalition government to an absolute dictator before the ink on the emergency decree is even dry.
So if we pull back from the specific history and look closely at the source code based on these two parallel stories, what is the actual checklist? If we are the political engineers looking at the blueprint of tyranny, what are the load-bearing pillars of the system?
Let me try to summarize the synthesis we have from the source notes. I think there are 5 or 6 big undeniable traits here. First on the list is glorified violence. It's not just an unfortunate byproduct of the movement, it's the entire point. It's how the followers physically prove their worth and purity.
Right, specifically violence directed at internal political enemies.
Second is the mythic past. The idea of making Rome great again or making Aryans great again. It relies on a plastic, fictionalized past that never actually existed in reality.
Yes, the promise of returning to an impossible golden age.
Third is the intense cult of the leader. There's always one charismatic strongman who claims that he, and only he, can truly speak for the soul of the nation. Fourth is a profound disdain for democracy. The movement uses democratic elections and free speech solely to gain power, but actively intends to dismantle those systems once inside. And fifth, the really big one we keep coming back to, is elite legitimization. The vampire absolutely has to be formally invited into the house by the mainstream power brokers.
That is a very solid, comprehensive list, and I would add a definitive sixth point based on the history. Expansionist war, the internal violence eventually has to turn outward. You bundle all those sticks tightly together so you can eventually hit someone else with it.
Okay, so that is the historical source code. That is the 1930s blueprint. Now, here is the really hard part of this deep dive. We have to carefully take that 6-point checklist and hold it up to the incredibly messy mirror of the 2020s.
This is exactly where the rubber meets the road.
Because we clearly see authoritarian strongmen rising in polls and elections all over the world today. We look at the data coming out of Hungary, India, Poland. We see heavily polarized rhetoric here in the United States that echoes some of the phrasing we just discussed. We see armed citizen militias. We see a documented global decline in the health of liberal democracies. The big question the sources tackle is the F word actually back? Are we currently watching fascism 2.0 boot up? Or is this modern phenomenon something structurally different?
And the political scientists and historians in our research stack are, well, they're actively fighting about it. There is absolutely no consensus.
And honestly, that academic disagreement is actually really helpful for us because it highlights the nuance of the current moment. Let's look at perspective A from the sources, which comes from the historian Federico Finkelstein. He has developed this concept he calls wannabe fascism.
Wannabe. It almost sounds dismissive, like he's describing a teenager starting a terrible garage band in their parents' house.
Yeah, it does sound a bit light,
Yeah.
but his underlying point is highly technical. He fiercely argues that true historical fascism requires the total permanent destruction of the democratic voting system. No more multi-party elections, a formal dictatorship. The system needs a Reichstag-fire moment to cross the finish line.
Right. Finkelstein points out that many of today's authoritarian-leaning leaders, take someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example. They certainly use the familiar rhetoric. They loudly talk about blood and soil. They constantly reference a mythic, pure national past. They target vulnerable outsider groups. But structurally, they're still operating within a legally bound constitutional framework.
So his point is, as long as the citizens can still technically go to a ballot box and vote the leader out of office, it mathematically isn't fascism yet.
That is his core argument. He prefers to call it extreme right-wing populism, not fascism. He says these modern leaders clearly want to be absolute fascists, hence the term wannabe. But the democratic institutions of the 21st century are generally much stronger and stickier than the fragile institutions of 1920s Europe. So the leaders are kept somewhat contained by the system.
So they're constantly pacing against the fence, but they haven't actually broken it down.
Exactly. But then you have perspective B in our stack from the political theorist Roger Griffin, and he thinks that whole technical distinction is a dangerous trap. He argues that we are obsessed with the wrong historical word entirely, and we are missing a massive new mutation called illiberal democracy.
Which inherently sounds like an oxymoron.
Right.
How can a nation possibly be a functioning democracy if it's entirely illiberal?
This is a really crucial, fascinating concept for understanding the modern world. Think of a democratic nation as a computer system that has two completely separate parts. You have the hardware, the physical voting booths, the grand parliament buildings, the printed paper ballots, and then you have the software that runs on it, the invisible values, unrestricted free speech, robust minority protections, truly independent judges, and the blind rule of law.
Okay, that makes sense. Hardware versus software.
Griffin argues that these new modern leaders have deeply studied history. They realize they don't actually need to be literal fascists to get what they want. They don't need to send thugs to burn down the parliament building like Hitler did. That's far too messy. That gets your country economically sanctioned by the global banking system.
So they just leave the building standing.
They enthusiastically keep the building, they keep the voting booths and the campaign rallies, but they quietly, systematically rewrite the software. They use state funds to buy up all the independent TV and radio stations so the political opposition gets absolutely zero positive airtime. They meticulously gerrymander the voting districts so they mathematically cannot lose a majority. They pack the Supreme Courts with extreme loyalists so the law is only ever harshly applied to their political enemies.
So on election day, you still wake up and go vote. It feels exactly like a democracy. You put your piece of paper in the designated box. But the actual outcome of that election was structurally decided 6 months ago in a boardroom.
Precisely. It becomes a zombie democracy. The corpse still walks around and talks about freedom, but the soul of it is dead inside. And Griffin strongly argues that this new model is actually much more dangerous than the blatant 1930s fascism in a practical way.
Why more dangerous? Just because it's subtle.
Because it's incredibly hard for the average citizen to spot until it's too late. It intentionally pacifies the population. If a dictator like Hitler rolls tanks down the street and violently takes over, you know exactly where you stand. You know you're in a dictatorship. You might form a violent resistance or revolt. But in a slow-moving, illiberal democracy, people just get frustrated and think, well, if I really don't like how things are going, I'll just canvass harder and vote differently in 4 years.
The internal feedback loop has already been severed. The system is completely rigged so that next time never actually brings any real change. It's essentially a slow, comfortable suffocation instead of a massive, undeniable heart attack.
That is a great way to summarize it.
Which connects really well to perspective C in our stack from the sociologist William Robinson. This is what I would call the follow the money approach to the F word.
Right. Robinson says, look, forget analyzing the populist ideology. Don't worry so much about the cultural symbols or the angry speeches. Watch the billionaire class. Watch the immense concentrations of capital.
It's the elite legitimization from our checklist all over again.
Completely. He argues that modern fascism, or whatever new flavor of authoritarianism we are dealing with, strictly requires the modern ruling class to enthusiastically bankroll it. He says you have to constantly watch for the moment of triangulation. This is the precise historical moment when the massive economic elites quietly decide that maintaining a liberal democracy is simply too expensive for their bottom line.
Too expensive how? What does that mean in practice?
Maybe corporate taxes are getting too high. Maybe environmental and labor regulations are deeply annoying to massive tech monopolies. Maybe the working class is demanding too large a share of the profits. So a critical mass of the elite class decides, you know what? All this democratic voting and striking is unstable and bad for business. Let's place our bets on the loud populist strongman. He'll crush the unions, slash the regulations, and vigorously protect our profit margins.
So when modern Silicon Valley billionaires or Wall Street megadonors start actively shaking hands with the extreme populist politicians, that's the real alarm bell.
According to Robinson, that is the ultimate flashpoint. That is the 1933 elite betrayal repeating itself in high definition.
Finally, there's perspective D from the historian Timothy Snyder. And his point isn't about economics or institutions. It's about the fundamental story a nation tells itself. He talks about this concept called the politics of eternity.
This one is deeply profound, I think. Snyder says that, the fascist source code is executing when politics entirely stops being about the future. Normal, healthy, democratic politics is essentially just pragmatic problem solving. How do we fix the crumbling roads? How do we improve the local schools? How do we balance the budget?
It's forward-looking.
Right. But the politics of eternity violently replaces all of that boring policy talk with a sweeping, mythic past. A totally fake golden age narrative where we, the pure, real citizens, were completely innocent, prosperous, and happy.
And the only conceivable reason we aren't perfectly happy right now is because of them.
Exactly. The dominant national narrative stops being about policy and becomes exclusively about purification. The story goes, the evil outsider came in and deliberately ruined our perfect society. It is a massive tabula rasa fantasy. The politician promises that if we just decisively remove the outsider, whether that's the new immigrant, the political leftist, the religious minority immediate, perfect harmony will magically return.
It's an incredibly seductive lie for a stressed population. Because if the root cause of every single problem is them, you don't actually have to do the incredibly hard, boring work of governing a complex society. You don't have to figure out how to fix massive macroeconomic inflation. You just have to ruthlessly purge the designated enemy.
And that narrative inevitably leads directly to the violence we talked about in the checklist, because once you successfully define the outsider as the literal source of all national evil and decay, doing absolutely anything to them physically becomes morally justified in the eyes of the followers.
So we have these four incredibly sharp, different lenses from the modern sources. The constrained wannabe fascism, the software hacking, illiberal democracy, the elite corporate triangulation, and the mythic politics of eternity. When we put all of these together, what is the final verdict of the deep dive? Are we currently living in 1933 or not?
The frustrating, honest verdict is ambiguity. And I know people deeply hate ambiguity. We all just want a simple yes or no answer so we know exactly how to feel. But history doesn't neatly repeat itself in identical loops. It rhymes.
We aren't going to see guys in literal vintage black shirts carrying actual wooden bundles of sticks down the street.
No, of course not. The aesthetic uniforms change. The specific cultural symbols change. Maybe today it's mass-produced red hats instead of tailored black shirts. Maybe it's highly coordinated digital harassment mobs on social media instead of sweaty street gangs with clubs. But the underlying patterns, the intense glorification of political violence, the obsession with a stolen mythic past, the quiet complicity of the wealthy elites, those structural elements are the absolute constant.
And that leads perfectly to the final, admittedly somewhat depressing thought that emerged from our deep dive into the historical sources. The overarching reflection on human nature itself.
Yeah. This is the really bitter pill we all have to swallow. We love to collectively think that we are incredibly modern, that we have supercomputers in our pockets, and therefore we are far too smart and educated to ever fall for this primitive trap again. We like to tell ourselves that 1930s Germany was just a bizarre, freak accident of history that could never happen here.
But the historical record shows it wasn't an accident at all.
It wasn't. If you zoom out and coldly look at the last 5,000 years of recorded human history, what is the actual statistical norm? The norm is brutal, top-down hierarchy. The absolute norm is domination. The norm is a charismatic, violent strongman ruling over a subservient tribe.
Democracy is the weird, fragile aberration. It's this incredibly delicate social experiment we've been trying to run for a very, very short period of human history.
And it is exceptionally fragile because it requires constant, exhausting effort. The ancient lizard brain inside all of us inherently likes a strongman who promises easy answers. It desperately likes the safety of belonging to a tightly bound bundle. It deeply enjoys having a clearly defined enemy to aggressively smash when things go wrong. Those dark instincts are literally hardwired into our biology.
So fascism isn't just a specific dead political party from Italy. It's an ever-present dormancy in our own human nature. It's exactly what naturally happens when a society gets tired, stops doing the incredibly hard work of being active citizens, and just begs to be protected by a father figure.
Exactly. No society is permanently immune to the source code.
So given all of that heavy historical context, what's the actual call to action here? Because we really can't just leave everyone staring blankly into the authoritarian void. And the answer obviously isn't just go argue with your uncle more aggressively on Facebook.
No, definitely not. The entire point of thoroughly deconstructing this historical source code isn't to just use the F word as a slightly more accurate insult at dinner parties. It is to clearly recognize the specific patterns before they fully execute. When you see political violence actively being rebranded as patriotism, when you see the complex, necessary debate about the future being totally replaced by an angry obsession with a mythic past, when you see the mainstream corporate elites quietly making cynical excuses for extreme radicals just to secure a tax break.
That is exactly when you need to check the engine light of your democracy.
That is when you have to wake up and pay close attention. We absolutely do not have to wait for the political prison camps to literally open, or for the national constitution to literally burn in the street, to know with certainty that something is structurally wrong. The historical patterns are the early warning system.
And extreme clarity is the best weapon we have. Knowing exactly how the source code was written means you can spot the massive hack before it completely takes over the operating system.
Very well said.
Well, this has definitely been a heavy, intense one, but I genuinely feel like I understand the actual machinery of this concept a lot better now. It's much less of an ambiguous, terrifying boogeyman and much more of a cold, predictable mechanism.
And if a machine is predictable, it is entirely preventable.
Exactly. Thank you so much for listening to this deep dive. Let us know what you think about the patterns we discussed today. Are we seeing wannabes, illiberal Democrats, or something else entirely in the modern landscape? We'd really love to hear your independent take on the sources.
Keep questioning everything.
And stay vigilant. We'll see you next time.